Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. A Fly is a series where I review the latest release or upcoming set for any and all cards that might have some form of impact in Commander. These episodes will be done under the assumption that you've already seen all of the cards in a set and isn't meant to be a spoiler video. This video is my own analysis on the cards I feel are most useful in the Commander format. A Fly is a sampling of several brews, so in this episode I'll be sampling all cards from the completely spoiled Zendikar Rising Commander precons. If you like any of the cards I'll be mentioning, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find a link to it down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. The best way you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. For $1, patrons get early access to scheduled videos on YouTube, and higher tier patrons get access to the VIP section of my Discord server. You can find a link to both in the description too. In fact, patrons got a chance to see this video earlier. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Zendikar Rising has a complimentary Commander Precon product like Ikoria did, only these are only 2 and there's only 3 cards in each one. So to say this will be a short flight is quite the understatement. However, that being said, these cards aren't filler and are actually pretty good. So let's start with the 2 new commanders and then the rest of the cards. Anawan the Ruin Thief is the face commander of the blue-black precon. He's a 2/4 vampire rogue for 2 generic, 1 blue and 1 black. He has a lord ability giving rogues you control +1/+1. He has another lord ability concerning rogues dealing combat damage. Whenever one or more rogues you control deal combat damage to a player, you essentially mill them for that amount of damage. Also, if any creatures are milled this way, you draw a card. Unfortunately, with the way it's worded, you can only draw 1 card per player regardless of how many creatures are milled. So the most you can draw is 1 card per player, assuming you milled at least 1 creature from the library when dealing them combat damage with your rogues. Some other rogue lords you can run with Anawan are Frog Tosser Banneret to reduce the cost of rogue spells you cast, which also include tribal spells, Una's Blackguard, which makes your other rogues enter the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it, Stinkdrinker Bandit that pumps our unblocked rogues +2/+1 until end of turn, Thieves Guild Enforcer to mill opponents by 2 every time we have a rogue enter the battlefield, and Soaring Thought Thief that gives all your rogues +1/+0 if an opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard. It also makes it so that whenever a rogue you control attacks, each opponent has to mill 2 cards, making it the best rogue lord for this kind of deck. These help make it a bit more solid of a rogue tribal deck since they are decent enough lords. There are plenty of tribal cards where you can choose the card type that can go in any tribal deck, so they're good enough here also. Sun Quan Lord of Wu is quite literally a lord, however he's not limited to just rogues. He can make all of our creatures essentially unblockable since he gives them all horsemanship. Keeper of Keys can also make all of our creatures unblockable if we started the turn being the Monarch. It also gives us the Monarch when it enters the battlefield, so there's that as well. It's also a rogue, which is another plus. That being said, since you want to guarantee rogues getting through, sometimes it's better if they already have unblockable stapled onto them. Triton Shorestalker, Slitherblade, Changeling Outcast, Blighted Agent, Ink Fathom Infiltrator, Invisible Stalker, Tetsuko Umezawa Fugitive, and Meringue River Prowler are straight up unblockable rogues. These are guaranteed to hit opponents and thus trigger anything that would trigger due to dealing combat damage. Tetsuko also has the potential to make your weenies unblockable too. Some other potentially unblockable rogues include Looter Ilkor, which is unblockable if no one has a creature with Shadow, and True Name Nemesis is also unblockable, at least by the creatures the chosen player controls. So these are 2 more rogues that can be used for getting through to opponents. Whirler Rogue is another way to make a creature unblockable by tapping down 2 untapped artifacts you control. Fortunately, it creates 2 artifact creatures when it enters the battlefield. It's also a rogue itself, so you can attack with it and also benefit from Anawan's ability. You also don't need to depend on Anawan to draw cards, especially since he's not an efficient card draw engine. Taking advantage of all of those unblockable creatures to draw cards by including Coastal Piracy, Biden of Thassa, and Reconnaissance Mission. Anytime any of your creatures deal combat damage, you draw a card per creature that connected. If you happen to have all 3 of them on the battlefield, you'll draw an insane amount of cards while also milling your opponents, of course. There are also a ton of amazing rogues you can include to round out your Anawan rogue tribal deck. Agent of Treachery combined with Zarathsan the Trickster, for which you can find a deck tech video in the link above, or other graveyard thievery shenanigans will also get you some cards, and both are rogues. Gonti Lord of Luxury is another way to steal cards by exiling them from the top of a library and then you being able to play them from exile whenever you want for any color of mana. Daring Thief can be used to swap control of a weak creature for an opponent's fatty or just a better creature overall, or any other non-land permanent for that matter. Brazen Borrower is another great cheap rogue that can be used as a single target Cyclonic Rift and then cast with Flash from exile if sent on an adventure. Canal Courier is a bit costly, but it makes you the Monarch when it enters the battlefield and it has the potential of being unblockable. Ghostly Pilferer can draw you cards whether by playing 2 when it untaps or whenever an opponent casts a spell from anywhere besides their hand. It also has the potential of being unblockable if you discard a card. Marsh Flitter creates 2 more rogues when it enters the battlefield and also has flying, which is a nice form of evasion. Bitter Blossom also creates flying rogue creature tokens at the beginning of your upkeep at the cost of 1 life. Bitter Blossom in particular is an amazing early game drop for an Anawan deck. Notion Thief is a great card anywhere since it's an excellent hate bear. However, if it can attack without the risk of dying, it's a 3/1, so it can also help in milling cards. Ogre Slumlord gives you something if your non-token rogues do happen to bite the dust by providing you with chump blockers that are excellent attack deterrents because they have Death Touch. Ranko Master of Pranks already has a Saboteur ability which is great for its body and keywords. You can make everyone discard a card or sacrifice a creature. Never make everyone draw a card unless it synergizes with your deck somehow. Rootwater Thief takes it one step further when dealing combat damage to a player, since you can pay 2 mana when it does to look through defending player's library for a card and exile it. You can also give it flying for just 1 mana. This card in and of itself is amazing, but is even better in this deck since it's a rogue. Thada Adel Acquisitor is another Saboteur that looks through an opponent's library to exile a card, only in this case it has to be an artifact, but at least you are able to cast it from exile until end of turn. Otherwise, it stays exiled. Knowledge Exploitation is another rogue that lets you search an opponent's library for a card. However, it has to be instant or sorcery and it allows you to play it for free. Since it has Prowl, you can essentially pay 4 mana to look through any opponent's library and free cast a tutor, an extra turn spell, or one of those epic spells like Expropriate and the like. Notorious Throng is another rogue that can be cast for its Prowl cost. This time the Prowl cost is more expensive than its casting cost, but if you do cast it for its Prowl cost, you create X flying rogue creature tokens where X is the damage you dealt to opponents so far, and you get an extra turn after this one. So if you're attacking with a ton of unblockable rogues, you're bound to cast this for its Prowl cost to get an extra turn as well as ton more rogues. This is definitely one of the best cards you can put in an Anawan deck. Cloak and Dagger is another amazing rogue card for an Anawan deck since it will attach to Anawan when he enters the battlefield, essentially giving him +2/+0 and Shroud for free. Enigma Thief is another great rogue for this deck, but it is in the pre-con, so I will go over it in greater detail further along in the video. Glasspool Mimic might only clone a creature you control, but at least it retains its creature types, which is important if we want it to benefit from all the lord effects in the deck. You can also play it as a land in a pinch, although it does enter the battlefield tapped if you do. Now, this wasn't a complete deck tech, but hopefully this microbrew gave you enough ideas to make your own fully formed Anawan the Ruin Thief Rogue Tribal deck. Abun Muldaya Ancestor is the face commander of the other precon, this one dedicated to landfall. Abun is definitely a commander better suited to a Voltron strategy since you can simply have his landfall trigger be used on himself to get bigger each time. In a dedicated landfall deck, include all the cards that allow you to drop additional lands per turn, he can get pretty huge. You can also replay lands from your hand by bouncing them there or from your graveyard by sacrificing them and then replaying them with things like Ramanop Excavator, Crucible of Worlds, or Ancient Green Warden. In fact, the Green Warden is even better for this deck since it'll help Abun trigger twice as well as any other landfall card in the deck. Since Obun's ability targets, be wary when giving him Shroud since he won't be able to target himself. Of these two commanders, I am currently brewing a deck for Abun, so it's almost a guarantee that he will appear in an episode of the brewery for this season. So if you're looking to get a lot of ideas for Abun, hit the notification bell and stay tuned. The other 4 new cards aren't legendary creatures, and while that was disappointing at first, some of these are actually pretty amazing cards, so no harm no foul. Trove Warden, in my opinion, is the second best one of the lot. Something simple you can do with it is use it to exile fetch lands. For example, you crash the fetch land and the land you fetch for will trigger it when it enters the battlefield. You can then exile the fetch land with its landfall ability. Then you can sacrifice it to get all of those fetch lands onto the battlefield untapped from your graveyard to use again. You can also use it in an Eggs deck where you can sacrifice a bunch of those cheap artifacts and then exile them with the landfall trigger. Then you can sacrifice Trove Warden to some effect to get them all back. You can then try reanimating it or recovering it later on to keep using its ability. Enigma Thief, mentioned earlier in my Anawan microbrew, is an amazing creature if you manage to cast it for its prowl cost. This means that you get a 5/5 flyer that bounces up to 3 non-land permanents to opponent's hands for just 4 mana. On its own, the card isn't that good and I consider it to be the weakest of the new cards, but it's still great in Sphinx Tribal and or Rogue Tribal decks like Anawan or Unesh Cryo Sphinx Sovereign. Whisperseal Dagger is, in my opinion, the second weakest of the new cards. It's not a bad card though, since it does pump a creature +2/+0 and gives them a good Saboteur ability. Whenever a equipped creature deals combat damage, you may cast a creature card from their graveyard using mana of any color to do so. This can be useful in discard-focused decks like Tiny Bones Trinket Thief, for which you can find a deck tech in the link above, Nath of the Guilt Leaf, or others, since you can then steal creatures they're discarding in order to take even further advantage of the disruption. You can also use it in mill decks like Murkovosk Minddrinker, Phoenix God of Deception, for which you can find a deck tech video in the link above, or others where you're able to then steal creatures from opponents' graveyards, which should be pretty full with all of the milling. The last new card of the precon is the best one in my opinion, and that's Geo Rager. This landfall ability is insane. If you're able to trigger its ability thrice, then the entire table's creatures are goaded and you're practically saved from getting attacked as long as you can keep it up. This is a great card for Obun, which is why it's included in his precon. If all creatures are forced to attack and not you, then that leaves less potential blockers to stop Obun. You can also include this in Marisi, Breaker of the Coil. Marisi is already trying to goad all of your opponent's creatures, but Geo Rager can further help with that strategy. You can follow the link above if you want to see my Marisi deck tech. It also grows great in Omnath, Locus of Creation, Omnath, Locus of the Royal, or Omnath, Locus of Rage, since these already have a landfall strategy to them. It's very easy to build stompy decks with these 3 commanders, so being able to prevent opponents from keeping many blockers is a great way to close out the game. Of these, you can find a link to a deck tech video for Omnath, Locus of Creation in the link above. This concludes this flight of the new cards from Zendikar Rising Commander Precons. I hope this episode has been informative for you, even though these are clearly my own opinions and views on the cards herein discussed. If you have any opinions or thoughts of your own on these cards, or if I overlooked any other great interactions with them, let me know in the comments. You can also find a link to all of the videos I mentioned and linked throughout the video in my description below if you want to see those commanders in greater detail, of which I mentioned those deck techs for. I want to take this opportunity to thank all of my patrons by giving a shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the Brewers, for their patronage. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of A Flight on the Commander Tavern. I am the Demented Kirby, and happy theory crafting.